Our opening thought comes from Walter Brueggemann and his work, The Prophetic Imagination. He writes, "The prophet engages in futuring fantasy. The prophet does not ask if the vision can be implemented, for questions of implementation are of no consequence until the vision can be imagined. The imagination must come before the implementation." Our next reading comes from The Radical Imagination, Social Movement Research in the Age of Austerity by Alex Kosnovich and Max Haven. They write, "At its most superficial, the radical imagination is the ability to imagine the world, life, and social institutions not as they are, but as they might otherwise be. It is the courage and the intelligence to recognize that the world can and should be changed. The radical imagination is not just about dreaming of different futures. It's about bringing those possibilities back from the future to work on the present, to inspire action and new forms of solidarity today." Our next reading comes from James Cone and his book, Martin and Malcolm and America, A Dream or a Nightmare. Cone writes, "Integrationism and nationalism represent the two broad streams of Black thought in response to the problem of slavery and segregation in America. Of course, no Black thinker has been a pure integrationist or a pure nationalist, but rather all Black intellectuals have represented aspects of each, with emphasis moving in one direction or the other, usually at different periods of their lives. What emphasis any Black thinker made was usually determined by his or her perspective on America. That is, whether they believed that Blacks would soon be included in the mainstream of American life on a par with whites. When Blacks have been optimistic about America, believing that they could achieve full equality through moral suasion and legal argument, they have been integrationists and have minimized their nationalist tendencies. On the other hand, despair about America, believing that genuine equality is impossible because whites have no moral conscience or any intention to apply the laws fairly, has always been the seedbed of nationalism. To understand Martin King's and Malcolm X's perspectives on America and their relation to each other, it is important to see them in the light of these two different but interdependent streams of Black thought." The world in which we live today is influenced by imagination. It's influenced by the imagination of those who have come before us, and also by the imagination of those who are living now. And more often than not, the world in which we live is the product of the imagination of the powerful and affluent within society. The question today is, how can we create an alternative prophetic imagination that will help us create a world that brings justice to all, including the most vulnerable? Imperial imagination, the imagination of the empire, perpetuates a nightmare for those whom it exploits in order to maintain and to expand its power. Prophetic imagination embraces the freedom to dream of liberation from this nightmare. Unfortunately, we are currently living within systems that are perpetuated by imperial imagination. As the Christian theologian Walter Brueggemann reminds us, prophetic imagination is needed to help break us free from imperial systems. But it involves much more than simply pointing out what is wrong with the way things are. Prophetic imagination engages in criticizing the current unjust systems while also energizing persons to imagine new and more just systems, and then to take the action that is necessary to bring into being a more just and more beloved community. In the Christian tradition, if you look at the Synoptic Gospels, the first three Gospels in the Christian Bible, Jesus is portrayed as having to resist the temptations of being recognized as powerful before Jesus begins a public ministry of good news and liberation with the poor, the vulnerable, and the oppressed. The power that is expressed, recognized, and celebrated by the wealthy and the elite is the antithesis of the way of love, justice, and liberation that is expressed in Jesus' ministry. In the prophetic tradition, in the Hebrew Bible, there is a clarion call for persons to strive for justice for the vulnerable and liberation of the oppressed, rather than clinging to power and its trappings of ease and prestige. In Buddhism, the Buddha reminds us that enlightenment and the compassion that flows from enlightenment are not possible if we are attached to power, are not possible if we are seeking recognition and approval from the powerful. We can never actualize ourselves authentically if we are seeking our validations as persons from the powerful. The economist Tim Jackson, writing about the thought of the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh, points out that in Thich Nhat Hanh's book, The Art of Power, which was published in 2008, Thich Nhat Hanh argues that what we think of as power in Western society is really a form of craving. Craving for wealth, craving for property, possessions, status, comfort, sex. And also craving for dominance over others in pursuit of these things. These cravings are the source of personal and societal suffering, and they are used by the imperial imagination to gain even more power and control over our lives. Thus, we see in many different traditions that the path to our best selves, is not paved with power. It's not paved with wealth. It's not paved with cravings, but rather it is paved with love and justice and compassion. And one of the most important decisions that we can make in this life relates to whether or not we will resist the lure and the temptation of embracing imperial power, and rather than accept the call to embrace the vulnerable and to liberate the oppressed. This choice is the difference between a life of subservience to the powers that bring privilege and prestige and a life committed to love of the least and the lost and to the transformation of unjust and oppressive systems that keep them from flourishing. When imperial powers bring us to a high place and show us all of the power and the glory they are willing to give us in exchange for our obedience, our answer must be a resounding and life-giving no. The prophet, the one with a prophetic imagination, should mourn and criticize actions that enable the persistence of situations that compromise core values that compromise the core values of love, justice, and oppression. And the prophet, the one with prophetic imagination, must imagine alternative policies, alternative visions that define our interests as a human community on the basis of those values. This was part of the prophetic power of Martin Luther King Jr., because he had the power to imagine what a more just community looks like. And he also, at the same time, had the power, as we know, to energize persons in the difficult and oftentimes sacrificial work to actually bring beloved community into existence. The champion for social justice, Bell Hooks, also expressed this power of an alternative and prophetic imagination when she wrote, "There must exist a paradigm, a practical model for social change that includes an understanding of ways to transform consciousness that are linked to efforts to transform structures." She saw the important connection between our consciousness, our ways of thinking, and the structures, the systems, the unjust systems within our society, and the need for us to transform them. The great social activist Dorothy Day also expressed the power of prophetic imagination when she proclaimed, "Our problems stem from our acceptance of this filthy, rotten system." Day recognized that in order to change our unjust systems, we have to resist accepting these systems as an unchangeable given. We must reject the unjust systems and bring forth new systems through an alternative, prophetic imagination. There's perhaps no other time during the year than this period, than the 4th of July, that we as a society get more mixed up about what it is to have an imperial imagination versus a prophetic imagination. There is perhaps no other time that our idolatry in relation to imperial imagination and imperial power is more on perverse display than on the 4th of July. The 4th of July, I like to remind my colleagues in Christian ministry, which is my tradition, I like to remind my colleagues that the 4th of July is not a Christian holiday. It's not even a religious holiday, but that would be difficult to know if you visited the vast majority of Christian churches in the United States this morning. So many churches and so many religious communities are marching so much in lockstep with imperial power brought forth by imperial imagination that it has literally become an object of worship, the very definition of idolatry. It is important to emphasize that the liturgical color in the Christian tradition for today is green, not red, white, and blue. The Pledge of Allegiance is not a Christian creed to be recited in church. The American flag is not a Christian or even a religious vestment. The national anthem is not a Christian hymn. It's difficult to cultivate an alternative prophetic imagination for a more just and beloved community when we are literally worshiping the symbols of imperial power brought forth by the unjust systems of imperial imagination. Walter Brueggemann once again reminds us that this is not prophetic imagination when we do that. He calls it pathetic imagination. What our communities and our societies as a whole need most, what they need most from our religious communities, is an alternative prophetic imagination that shows us that we do not simply have to accept our filthy and unjust systems as they are, and that energizes us all to work towards something new, towards something more loving, towards something more just. May it be so. May we make it so together. Our parting thought comes from Maria Montessori from her work, The Absorbent Mind. She writes, "Imagination does not become great until human beings, given the courage and the strength, use it to create."